Hi everyone, welcome to the video. In this video I want to talk about intellectuals, what intellect is. I also want to talk about expertise, and then I want to finish by talking about different problems that I see in our culture in relation to information flow and all of the information and facts and data that's out there that we're trying to make sense of as we navigate our lives. So just for more context, there are really two reasons why I'm interested in this topic. For those who don't know, I'll give you a brief history of my life. So I spent 5 years trying to get my undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering from 2013 to 2018. I got it. Then I did 4 years in the Marine Corps as a logistics officer, focused on planning and strategically trying to help my Marines get to where they needed to go with the gear that they needed to have to accomplish whatever mission they were trying to accomplish. I then spent 2 years in corporate America working for the Home Depot as a business analyst for 1 year and then as a systems engineer for a second year. So again, more planning, more data analysis, working more in the realm of abstraction. And I just recently received my master's degree in general psychology, and I'm currently applying for PhD programs for clinical psychology to try to go down that path. So the theme I want to illustrate from my history is that I enjoy generating, manipulating, and synthesizing abstract concepts and ideas and plans and working in imagination to try to facilitate more effective and efficient action in reality. All of that to say that I think that I'm an intellect. And before we go on to the next topic, I'm using the word intellect specifically in terms of personality psychology. So to say that someone's an intellect is very similar to saying that someone is tall or saying that someone is short. It's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just how they are, and there's pros and cons to being tall, and there's pros and cons to being short, just as there are pros and cons to being highly intellectual, and there are pros and cons to being low in intellect. So maybe that's something we'll dive deeper into, but just want to throw that caveat out there. And intellect is also not the same thing as intelligence, as your IQ, or as your general cognitive factor. I'm saying intellect, not intelligence. Okay. So one of the reasons that I'm interested in these topics is because I consider myself an intellect and I'm interested in ideas, and I'm trying to figure out what my role for society should be as an intellectual. Okay. A second reason I'm interested in these ideas is because I'm a consumer of information, and I'm also a producer of information, but that is associated more with the first reason. For the second reason, I've just noticed that I struggle to try to figure out what is true when I come across a headline, when I come across something on X, or I see something on Instagram. It's very difficult to understand what the facts are, what is true, what is real. And I often notice that people can be looking at the same set of facts or the same few headlines and come away with vastly different opinions and interpretations of what is true and what is real. And so as a consumer of information, I'm trying to cater my information atmosphere optimally so that way I can understand what is true and I can make better decisions for myself and for my family. So those are two reasons why I'm interested in what it is to be an intellectual, because to a large degree, it's intellectuals that are putting information out there, or at least for my specific situation and for my friends, the people that we listen to that are producing information are intellectuals. So I'm trying to figure out really two problems. That's what I'm trying to think through. How can I produce the best information? How can I put out content that is helpful and useful to people, but is also, to the best of my ability, true? And then also, how can I set up my information channels such that I receive the best information, again, within my limits? So that's kind of the background of the context for trying to think through these problems. So let's turn to the first concept of an intellectual and the personality aspect, intellect. So again, I'm approaching this from a personality psychology perspective. I'm going to use the theory of the Big Five paradigm. And so this theory says that you can understand most individual differences, so people's personalities, using 5 dimensions or traits, and those are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, more researchers who are proponents of this theory, such as Jordan Peterson and Colin DeYoung, have also found that you could split those 5 factors into big 10 aspects. And so for each trait or factor, you could have 2 aspects for underneath all of them. And I won't go through all of them, but for our purposes for this video, trait openness can be split into openness to experience or aesthetics and intellect. And you can measure people's intellect by asking them questions or asking their friends questions about them. And the questions would be something like, do you have a rich vocabulary? Do you enjoy philosophical pontification? Do you think quickly through problems? Do you enjoy, I don't know, can you think critically about various issues? That's another way of asking the same question. But basically, you can ask people questions like this and you'll get various correlations, and then you can score those correlations as related to other people to get a measure of their intellect. And so one of the ways that you can define intellect is just someone who, or the capacity of intellect, the personality trait, is the ability to generate, manipulate, and synthesize abstract ideas. So concepts, words, plans, images, things like that. And when it comes to intellect, it is associated with your competency, but it's also associated with just the fact that you prefer to do that kind of activity and you enjoy that kind of thing. Intelligence is more associated with your actual faculty, your competence to do those things. But intellect also brings in this factor of whether or not you like to do that thing or you're interested in abstract discussions. So what does that mean for someone to be an intellectual? From my perspective, to be an intellectual is to have that general preference to navigate the world such that you are thinking and reflecting a lot about things. You can conceptualize thinking as just abstracted or simulated action. So when you think, usually this is one way to understand it, you set a goal, you generate a whole bunch of action predicated solutions that might help you attain that goal. You then run the simulation in your mind where you select one solution and then see if it works. And then you measure the outcome of that solution to your initial goal to see if that's a viable solution. And so you simulate your actions in imagination before you do it in the real world. And you can understand that there's an adaptive capacity to that, where potentially animals who can simulate their actions before they implement them might have a survival or reproductive advantage, so that way they can take more factors into account, and if their action plan fails, they only die in abstraction rather than them dying in reality. So that's thinking, that's intellect. And to be an intellectual just means that you have a knack for that kind of thing, but you also enjoy it a lot. Now, it's not always good to be an intellectual, let's just say that. Everyone has the aspect in their personality of intellect, but intellect, like all of the personality traits, are normally distributed. So that means that most people fall within an average, and then there are some people who are higher, and there's some people who are lower in that trait or aspect. And you can think that a reason for that is that, like I said, from an evolutionary perspective, it's not always good to think before you act. Maybe sometimes you need to be impulsive. Maybe sometimes you need to act quickly and decisively. And if you spend too much time thinking, well, maybe you miss opportunities, or maybe you actually die because you didn't act quick enough. one of the things that I've experienced also is that there are times in my life where I just think too much, and the thinking, the rationalizing, the reasoning becomes this kind of voice that is not always positive, and sometimes it's negative, and sometimes it's overly critical, and sometimes it brings up past memories and regrets, and it's like, here, look at this, look at how horrible you are. And that's something that I imagine that many people will wrestle with, and that's something that I'm currently wrestling with, is trying to understand how to channel that intellectual aspect into something that is beneficial. And sometimes you do need that critical voice to point out to you your flaws and to highlight where you could be better. And sometimes it's unnecessary and you want to turn it off. There could also be times where like thinking isn't the same thing as paying attention, and thinking is also not the same thing as experiencing something in the moment, like a play or a beautiful piece of music or spending time with loved ones. You don't always want to be rationalizing and propositionalizing and thinking, what if this happens? Or how about this? And making all these different associations. Sometimes you just want to have that inner quietness in your mind, and you just want to be present. So it's not always good to be highly intellectual. And from an evolutionary perspective, from a population level perspective, there's a reason that there's an average. Again, there's a normal distribution, and then there's some people who are higher and some people who are lower. Okay, so now going into expertise. As I was writing about this, I found myself struggling to define intellect and what it means to be an intellectual, particularly from the perspective of the layperson or the perspective of the culture, to the degree that I can do that. One of the things that I saw was this term being thrown around at people for not being an expert, essentially, but speaking out either on their various platforms anyway. And this term was pseudo-intellectual or pseudo-scientist. I'll use the first term going forward. And I noticed that people were calling speakers pseudo-intellects or pseudo-intellectuals when they didn't have a PhD, but they were talking about something that you could get a PhD in, or they might have had a PhD in one field, but they're talking about something where they don't have a PhD in that field. And so as I was trying to understand what people meant by this term pseudo-intellectual, I thought that, well, they're saying this person is not an expert in this field, but they're speaking about that field. And to me, that always rubbed me the wrong way, because that's just not how I understood what it meant to be an intellectual. In my opinion, an intellectual is just someone who likes talking about ideas. That's what they are. That's different from being an expert, where to be an expert, that's a tricky concept to nail down as well, because I currently am involved in a psychology research lab, and so I'm around faculty members who not only have their PhDs, but have published 100 papers and are well known in their field and have given different lectures on different topics. And then I work with everyone from them all the way down to first year PhD students. And so I have a general experience with the whole gamut, at least in the field of psychology. And it's not so easy to define what it is to be an expert. I feel like to the layperson, well, you have your PhD, therefore you're an expert. It's like, that's when you're just starting, honestly. My wife is a physician, and many of her friends, I've watched them through their careers from second and third year med school students to first and second year residents, and they have definitely learned a lot, but they wouldn't call themselves experts. It's not like as soon as you get your MD, boom, you're an expert physician, and now you can go out and talk to anyone about anything. It's like there's also this narrowing in the field that happens, that the longer, it's a general tendency, it's not something that everyone does, but the longer you are in these fields, again, I can really speak to only psychology and medicine, there tends to be a narrowing where you specialize. And so someone who's been working as a psychologist for 30 years, there may be an expert in social anxiety, but that doesn't mean that they're also an expert in schizophrenia, or they are also an expert in episodic memory, or they're also an expert in social relations and attachment theory. It's like, no, they develop their expertise in a specific field, and then people go to them for those specific problems because they understand, what's going on. So to me, expertise is something that we highlight and kind of throw around, but as more information is being produced and being consumed, I think that we need a discussion as a culture to get a better understanding of what it is to be an expert. Because it used to be that the heuristic was, if you wanted to know what was true, just go listen to the experts. If you wanted to understand what's going on in science, if you wanted to understand what's going on in medicine or in politics, it's like there were expert political commentators, and you had to subscribe to their newsletter, or there were expert scientific journals and you had to subscribe to that journal. But today, one, there's maybe thousands of scientific and academic journals. There are many independent media sources. There are many mainstream media sources, actually, too. Now that we're all interconnected across the entire world, people can go to they can get news via the mainstream media sources of different countries. And so that's one way to get diversity and understand different perspectives. And then you just have like lay people who, like me, can go on YouTube and just start putting videos out there. So how do you sift through that information? That's kind of the problem that that I think has to be worked through in our culture, given this large increase in information flow that is just going to continue to increase due to our technological revolutions. We used to have the heuristics that large centralized institutions filled with experts would only put out the best information that would go to the public, and the public could just go to those one-stop shops. But due to, particularly in America and the West more broadly, various things that have happened over the past 5 to 10 years, there is a lack of trust in expertise, and there's a lack of trust in institutions. Like, what does it mean to be a historic expert? Could you have just read a whole bunch of books? Could you have just read a whole bunch of books? There's nothing wrong with reading a whole bunch of books. We have this traditional sense that an expert is someone who has a PhD and has spent 20 to 30 years in the field reading and talking and discussing and analyzing only those things, and they're hyper specialists. But if we use that heuristic, it doesn't seem like that is tenable anymore for many reasons. One of the reasons being that the error that you might make, that we can make as society, would be a false negative error, where if only experts can produce information and people should only listen to those experts, well, then you might miss a lot of other good information that's out there that lay people or non-experts or novices would put out there. And so we need a different set of criteria by which we produce and consume information. And I'm not saying that this has to be a top-down insistence either. I'm trying to understand this for myself, and hopefully just share with other people what would be different guidelines that I would hold, that I would use, that I found helpful, and maybe you will find them helpful. And then maybe there could actually be this kind of bottom-up consensus that gets established, where I'm not sure exactly what it looks like, but again, not saying that it has to be top down. Now, the other error that we could make, if only listening to experts and centralized authorities can lead to false negatives, well, then you also get false positives on the other side, where if there's too much information flow and if everyone's just talking about everything and everyone's listening to everything, well, you might listen to some things that are not true, and you might act in the world and make decisions upon data that you received that's invalid and incorrect, and that's not good either. And so we're trying to find this balancing point where you can't listen to everything, so you have to make some decisions, which implies that a criteria would be set. And the question just becomes, well, what is that criteria and how strict do we make that criteria? I think that's the question. And for me, like, here are some things that I do. One, I've listened to people and I read people and I follow people who, when I act out their ideas that they've offered, it has led to better outcomes in my life on average. So to me, that pragmatic, functional element of listening to what someone says and then trying it in my job, trying it in my studies, trying it in my relationship with my wife, and it works and things get better, I'm going to increase the credibility of that source of information for me personally, just by a little bit. And to the degree that things keep working in my life, I'm going to keep listening to that person, and I'm going to refer that person to other people, and then I'm going to check back and see, like, oh, hey, do you agree with what this person says? Has it been working for your life? And then I use my social network to also kind of triangulate on the credibility or validity of what this person is saying. And that's something that's been helpful. Now, a second thing that I do is, and this is also a testament to the sources of information, and one example I bring up is just Jordan Peterson. He will talk to people who disagrees with him on many different matters. And so he had many conversations with Sam Harris, particularly where they debated different religious issues. And now I still listen to Sam Harris, and I don't always agree with everything he says, but I like his way of thinking. And so if Dr. Peterson and Sam Harris give out the same piece of advice or say the same thing or come away with the same interpretation of an event in the world, I know that they are relatively different people who disagree on a whole host of things. And so to me, I'm trying to apply what in psychometric psychology is called the multi-trait, multi-method construct validity technique. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to see, well, the more diverse my sources of information are, yet they still say the same thing, the higher the probability that what they're saying is correct. So that's another thing that I try to do. So first, I try to overlay a pragmatic lens on all of the information that I receive, and then I dwindle down my sources of information, and I only maintain those sources which have helped me in my life and also helped some of my friends in my life. The second thing that I do is I try to diversify, and I try to see how are these sources of information, whether it's mainstream media, whether it's different news articles, different books, different epistemologies, or different podcasters, where are they different? And what is the likelihood that even though they are different in various ways, they would still converge on the same interpretation or the same assertion or the same piece of advice? So those are maybe the two biggest standards that I would like to offer to you all in terms of how to sift through the information, given that there's so much of it out there. Try to test it out, and then try to get a diverse range of sources of information, and then attend to that which is constant across all those different sources of information, and that will increase your likelihood that what you're looking at or what you're interpreting is correct. It's still not foolproof, it's still not perfect, but I think that we can agree, hopefully as a culture, that both of these extremes of siloed, hyper-specialized, hyper-expertise modes of information is not always good. And then hopefully we could also agree that chaotic, random sources of information is also not good. And so we have to find some way in the middle to figure out both how can we produce good information, but also how can we consume good information so that way we can live better lives. So I don't exactly know how the intellectual played into all of this, but that's okay. I'm going to end the video there. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.